The road hummed beneath the steady rhythm of 18 wheels, a lullaby of asphalt and diesel that had cradled countless nights for men like him. It was just another Tuesday in the life of a trucker. No grand expectations, no warnings whispered in the wind. The dispatch had been routine, a short haul, barely 40 minutes from the warehouse to the drop-off point, a stretch of highway so familiar it could have been traced in his sleep, the kind of run that made the job feel less like a marathon and more like a quick sprint, easy money, minimal fuss. But somewhere between the first gear shift and the last, the ordinary unraveled into something far darker, far stranger. And 3 years later, the questions still hung in the air, like the ghostly echo of a horn left unanswered. He had signed off on the load with the usual efficiency, pallets of auto parts. Nothing exotic, nothing heavy enough to slow him down. The paperwork was in order, the rig inspected, the coffee in his thermos still steaming when he pulled out of the lot at 3:17 p.m. The sun was high, the weather clear, the CB radio chattering with the usual banter about traffic and truck stops. No one could have guessed that this would be the last time anyone would see him behind the wheel. Not his dispatcher, who waved him off with a casual "see you back here before supper." Not the diner waitress, who'd refilled his coffee an hour earlier, joking about how he always took it black, like his sense of humor. And certainly not the family waiting at home, already setting the table for a dinner he would never attend. The route was simple: Interstate 10 East, to the exit at mile marker 127, a left onto County Road 9, then straight into the loading bay of a parts distributor just outside El Paso. A drive so short he hadn't even bothered to pack a lunch. But somewhere along that stretch of pavement, where the desert swallowed the horizon and the cell signal flickered like a dying bulb, he vanished. No distress call, no skid marks, no witnesses, just an empty cab, a still running engine, and a logbook left open to a page that would never be finished. Then, 3 years later, a discovery that made the case even more baffling. His rig, unmistakable in its company livery, the same one he'd climbed into that afternoon, was found abandoned in a field just outside Nogales, Mexico, over 500 miles from where he was supposed to be. The doors unlocked, the keys gone, the cargo untouched, and not a single soul able to explain how it got there. A lot. What turns a 40-minute drive into a 3-year mystery? What force could reroute a man and his truck across an international border without a trace? The answers, if they exist, are buried deeper than the ruts in a back road. But one thing is certain: the road remembers. And if you listen closely enough, it might just tell you what happened to him. So buckle up. The journey into the unknown starts now. Behind the wheel of his weathered but reliable Freightliner, he was more than just a driver. He was a storyteller of the open road, a man who carried the weight of deadlines and the quiet pride of a job done right. His name was Marcus Holloway, though most just called him Hollow after years of signed delivery sheets and CB radio chatter. To those who knew him, he wasn't just another rig hauling freight. He was the steady hand behind the wheel, the guy who could coax an extra 100 miles out of a tired engine with little more than a wrench and a whispered promise. His routine was a rhythm, as predictable as the hum of his tires on asphalt. Up before dawn, coffee black and bitter, the kind that could strip paint but kept him sharp. He'd check the logs, run his hands over the rig, like a doctor taking a pulse. Tires, brakes, the faint groan of the suspension settling under its own weight. The road was his office, the cab his sanctuary. He knew every inch of it, the way the seat creaked when he shifted, the exact angle of the rearview mirror that let him see the horizon without catching his own reflection. There was comfort in the repetition, in the way the miles unfolded like a map he'd memorized long ago. But why trucking? It wasn't just the paycheck or the solitude, though those were part of it. It was the way the world looked from 6 feet off the ground, the way the landscape blurred into streaks of green and gray at 65 miles an hour. It was the quiet satisfaction of delivering something essential. Medicine, food, parts that kept factories running. Without fanfare, he liked being the ghost in the machine, the unseen force that kept things moving. And he was good at it. Dispatchers trusted him with the tightest schedules, the most delicate cargo. He had a sixth sense for weather, for traffic, for the unspoken rules of the road that separated the pros from the pretenders. Yet there were cracks in the routine, moments that didn't fit. The way he'd sometimes pull over at a rest stop just to watch the sunrise, like he was memorizing the colors. The way he kept a single faded photo tucked behind the sun visor, a woman and a little girl, their smiles frozen in time. The way he'd occasionally mutter to himself on the CB, not for an answer, but as if the static might carry his words somewhere they needed to go. And then there were the calls home, always too short, always ending with the same quiet promise. Next run, I'll make it back for longer. But what if the road had other plans? What if the miles he'd logged, the borders he'd crossed without a second thought, had been leading him somewhere else entirely? Because 3 years later, his rig would be found hundreds of miles off course, parked as if he'd simply stepped away for a moment and never come back. And the question lingers, heavy as the silence in an empty cab. What or who was he really delivering that day? The engine of the old Freightliner Cascadia rumbled to life with a deep, throaty growl, its diesel heart pounding against the stillness of the early morning. The truck, a weathered beast of steel and chrome, its once glossy black paint, now dulled by years of highway dust and relentless sun, stood out like a shadow against the pale glow of dawn. Its headlights cut through the thick, unnatural fog that clung to the asphalt, curling around the wheels like ghostly fingers, reluctant to let go. The cab smelled of stale coffee, leather, and the faint metallic tang of engine oil, a scent as familiar to him as his own breath. He adjusted the worn-out seat, the springs groaning under his weight, and glanced at the dashboard, fuel full, gauges steady, the GPS already plotting the route. Just 47 miles, a quick run, too quick, almost. The road ahead stretched empty, an endless ribbon of gray swallowed by the mist. No other headlights pierced the gloom, no distant hum of engines, not even the usual chatter of the CB radio. Just static, a hollow hiss that seemed to whisper secrets in a language no one could understand. The silence was wrong. He'd driven this route 100 times before, knew every curve, every pothole, every diner where the coffee was strong enough to strip paint. But today, the world felt off. The air was too thick, pressing against the windshield like it wanted in. The trees lining the highway stood unnaturally still, their branches twisted into shapes that looked almost deliberate, as if they'd been arranged by unseen hands. He shifted gears, the truck lurching forward with a shudder, and the fog seemed to part just enough to let him through, before closing in again behind him, erasing the road he'd already traveled. The wipers squeaked against the windshield, though there was no rain, only that damp, clinging haze that refused to lift. His fingers tightened around the wheel. The GPS blinked, recalculating for no reason. 47 miles had never felt so long. Somewhere in the distance, a sound cut through the silence. Not a horn, not an engine, but something lower, almost like a groan, carried on the wind. He leaned forward, squinting. Nothing. Just the fog, just the road, just the creeping certainty that he wasn't as alone as he seemed. And then, the first sign that something was very, very wrong. The exit ramp he always took, the one that would loop him back toward home, it wasn't there anymore. In its place, a stretch of cracked pavement veered off into the darkness, unmarked, uncharted. The GPS flickered, its screen glitching for a split second before rerouting him down a path he'd never seen before. His stomach twisted. He knew better than to trust a machine over his own eyes, but his own eyes were telling him things that made no sense. The truck rolled forward, slow now, hesitant. The fog thickened. The world outside the cab felt like it was holding its breath, and for the first time in 20 years behind the wheel, he wondered if he should turn back. But something deep in his gut, told him it was already too late for that dot. The road ahead should have been familiar, a straightforward stretch of highway, barely 40 minutes from start to finish. But as the headlights of the rig cut through the thickening dusk, something felt wrong. The GPS hummed its steady directions, yet the driver's fingers tightened around the wheel, his knuckles whitening under the dim glow of the dashboard. The air itself seemed heavier, pressing against the cab like an unseen weight. He had driven this route 100 times before, but tonight the landmarks were shifting, or worse, missing. A flicker of movement caught his eye in the side mirror. Not another trucker, not a late-night commuter, but something darker, lower to the ground. A black sedan, sleek and unmarked, had been trailing him for miles now, keeping just far enough back to blur into the shadows when he checked. Too deliberate to be coincidence. His foot eased off the accelerator. Just a fraction. Testing. The sedan slowed in perfect sync. A cold prickle ran down his spine. No one followed delivery trucks on these back roads. Not unless they wanted something. Then came the weather. One moment, the sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the promise of rain. The next, a wall of fog rolled in. Not the thin mist that clung to river valleys, but a dense, choking shroud that swallowed the road whole. The high beams did nothing, only reflecting back at him in a sickly yellow haze. The GPS signal flickered, then died with a static hiss. His breath came shorter now. He knew these roads, knew where the turns should be, where the old gas station stood with its rusted sign. But the fog didn't just obscure, it erased. The world beyond the windshield had become a void. And then, the radio. He hadn't touched it, but the dial turned on its own, clicking through static until a voice cut through, a woman's, whispering in a language he didn't recognize. Not Spanish, not anything local. The words slithered, rhythmic, like a chant. His hand shot out to kill the power, but the voice didn't stop. It seeped from the speakers, from the walls of the cab, wrapping around him until his pulse hammered in his throat. The sedan was gone now. Or maybe it had never been there at all. He should have turned back. Every instinct screamed it. But the road behind him was just as swallowed by fog as the path ahead. And then, headlights. Not behind him this time. Ahead. 2 pinpricks of red in the gloom, growing brighter, closer. Too wide for a car, too high for a truck. The engine of his rig groaned as he braced, foot hovering over the brake. The lights didn't pass. They stopped, waiting. Somewhere in the fog, something laughed. And just like that, the road beneath him wasn't his anymore. The road had been familiar once. A straight shot through rolling hills, the hum of the engine, a steady companion beneath him. But now, the landscape had shifted, twisted into something unrecognizable. The 2-lane blacktop that should have led him back to the depot had narrowed, the asphalt cracking like old bones beneath the weight of his rig. The trees, once sparse and orderly, now crowded the shoulders, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky as if trying to drag the last light of day into the earth. He slowed the truck, his fingers tightening around the wheel, the leather creaking under his grip. The GPS had been glitching for miles, first lagging, then freezing entirely on a blue dot, suspended in a void of gray. No signal, no landmarks, just the growing certainty that something was very, very wrong. The air smelled different here, thicker, the scent of damp earth, and something metallic, like rust or old blood, seeped through the vents. He rolled down the window, but the breeze brought no relief. Only the whisper of leaves that sounded too much like voices, murmuring just beyond his hearing. His headlights cut through the gathering dusk, illuminating patches of gravel and the occasional flash of eyes, deer, maybe, or something else, vanishing into the underbrush. He should have turned back when the weather changed, when the sky, clear and bright at dispatch, had darkened into a bruised purple, heavy with the threat of rain that never fell. But he'd pressed on, convinced the next exit would bring him back to known territory. Now, The exits were gone. The signs, if there had ever been any, were missing or painted over with symbols he didn't recognize. His breath came faster, shallow pulses that fogged the windshield. He wiped it away with the back of his hand, but the mist returned instantly, as if the glass itself were sweating. The dashboard clock ticked forward, but time felt elastic, stretching and snapping back in ways that made his stomach clench. He reached for the radio, twisting the dial through static that hissed like a nest of angry snakes. No dispatch, no other drivers, just the hollow silence of a frequency that should have been alive with chatter. His mind raced through the possibilities. A wrong turn, a detour he hadn't been told about, a prank gone too far, but none of them explained the way the road seemed to unspool behind him, as if the miles he'd traveled had been erased. Then, the engine sputtered, a rough, wet cough that shook the cab. The temperature gauge crept into the red, though the air outside was cold enough to see his breath. He eased off the gas, coasting to a stop on the shoulder. But the shoulder wasn't there anymore. The truck listed slightly, the passenger side wheels sinking into soft earth. He killed the ignition, and the sudden silence was worse than the noise. No hum of tires, no idle rumble, just the distant cry of something not quite human, carried on a wind that smelled of wet ash. He grabbed the flashlight from the glove box, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the switch. The beam flickered to life, weak and yellow, barely cutting through the dark. When he stepped down from the cab, his boots sank into mud that sucked at his soles like a living thing. For the first time in 20 years behind the wheel, he didn't know which way to turn. The road behind him was just as foreign as the one ahead, and the stars above, when he dared to look, were wrong. Too bright, too many, arranged in patterns that made his eyes ache. He thought of his wife's voice, the way she'd laughed when he'd kissed her goodbye that morning. Just an hour, she'd said. Don't dawdle. He should have dawdled. He should have dawdled. He should have stopped for coffee. He should have done anything but drive straight into this nothingness, where the rules of the world seemed to bend, and the night pressed in like a hand over his mouth. And then, headlights. A pair of them, low and wide, emerging from the darkness like eyes opening in the deep. They didn't bob or sway. They moved in a straight, unnatural line, growing larger without sound. His pulse hammered in his throat. He raised the flashlight, waving it in desperate arcs, but the beams didn't waver, didn't blink, just came on, relentless, until the glow swallowed the night whole. He stumbled back against the truck, the metal cold through his shirt, and for the first time, he understood the kind of fear that doesn't scream, the kind that roots you in place, whispering that some doors, once opened, can't be closed again. What would you have done, standing there in the dark, with the road behind you gone, and the road ahead leading only deeper into the unknown? Would you have run? Would you have stayed? Or would you, like him, have realized too late that some wrong turns aren't just mistakes, they're invitations? The road ahead stretched like a frayed nerve, each mile unspooling into the unknown as the hum of the engine grew louder in his ears. No longer a familiar rhythm, but a mechanical whisper, urging him deeper into territory his maps had never charted. His fingers tightened around the wheel, knuckles pale beneath the dim glow of the dashboard lights, because something was wrong. Not just the absence of landmarks, or the way the GPS had surrendered to a spinning blue dot hours ago, but the way his own mind had begun to betray him. The confidence that once settled in his chest, like a second heartbeat, now flickered, unstable as the headlights cutting through the thick, unnatural dark dot. He had driven this route, or what should have been this route, 100 times before. Short hauls, easy money, the kind of job that let him hum along to the radio while the miles melted away. But tonight, the road had twisted itself into something else. The trees lining the highway stood too still, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers, and the air carried a scent he couldn't place, damp earth, and something metallic, something old. His breath hitched as the cab filled with the ghost of his wife's voice, a memory slipping through the cracks of his focus. You've got a good sense of direction, babe. Better than any GPS. Her laughter, warm and certain, now felt like a taunt, because he didn't recognize a single turn, a single exit, and worse, he wasn't sure he ever had. The doubt coiled tighter. With every passing minute, had he missed a sign, taken a wrong turn in the fog that had rolled in like a thief, stealing visibility, stealing certainty? His mind reeled back to the last truck stop, the way the cashier's eyes had lingered a second too long when he'd asked for directions. "You sure you're headed the right way, buddy?" The words echoed now, laced with something unspoken, something that made his stomach clench. He could almost hear the static of the CB radio crackling to life with warnings he'd ignored. Stories of drivers who'd vanished on stretches of road, just like this one. Urban legends, he'd told himself then. But legends had to start somewhere, didn't they? A flicker in the rearview mirror snatched his attention. A pair of headlights, distant but gaining. His pulse spiked. No one had passed him in hours. No one should be out here. The truck's shadow loomed larger in the side mirrors, a silent predator closing in, and for the first time, he wondered if he was being followed, or worse, if he was being led. The thought slithered into his mind, cold and insistent. What if the road wasn't just lost? What if it was taking him somewhere? The question settled in his gut like a stone, heavy and undeniable. He reached for the radio, fingers trembling, but the dial turned with no resistance, no sound, as if the airwaves themselves had been severed. And then, just beyond the reach of his headlights, a shape emerged on the shoulder of the road, a vehicle, abandoned. Its doors hung open, like a mouth frozen mid-scream, and the wind carried the faintest creak of metal settling, as if the thing were still alive, still breathing. His foot eased off the gas without conscious thought, the truck slowing to a crawl. He shouldn't stop. Every instinct screamed at him to keep moving, to pretend he'd seen nothing, but something deeper, something primal, pulled his gaze toward the darkness ahead, toward the answer to a question he wasn't sure he wanted to ask. What happens when the road you trust betrays you? When the only thing left to guide you is the gnawing certainty that you've been wrong about everything? The night held its breath, waiting, and so did he. The night had swallowed the highway whole, leaving only the faint glow of his headlights to carve a path through the suffocating dark. He had driven this stretch 100 times before, yet tonight the road felt alien, as if the very asphalt beneath his tires had shifted when he wasn't looking. The hum of the engine, usually a steady comfort, now pulsed like a warning. And then he saw it, a vehicle, skeletal and abandoned, crouched in the ditch like a wounded animal. Its doors hung ajar, swaying slightly in the wind, as if breathing. The paint, once vibrant, was now blistered and peeling. The metal beneath rusted into jagged wounds. No lights, no movement, just the hollow shell of something that had once been alive, left to rot under a sky, heavy with unspoken secrets. He slowed the rig, his fingers tightening around the wheel. Every instinct screamed at him to keep moving, to leave this ghost behind in the dark. But something deeper, something primal, pulled him toward it. The air inside the cab thickened, pressing against his skin like damp fingers. His breath came shallow, fogging the windshield in uneven bursts. Stepping onto the gravel shoulder, the crunch beneath his boots sounded too loud, too final. The abandoned car loomed closer, its silence more deafening than any engine roar. A single, cracked headlight stared back at him, empty, yet somehow watching. The wind carried the scent of old oil, and something else, something metallic, something wrong. His pulse hammered in his throat as he reached for the driver's side door, the hinge groaning like a dying whisper. Inside, the seats were torn, the dashboard gutted. A single, mud-caked boot print marred the floorboard, too large to be a child's, too small to be his own. And there, half buried under shattered glass, a faded receipt from a truck stop, 2 states over, dated today. The world tilted. His hands trembled as he traced the ink, the numbers blurring before his eyes. This wasn't just an abandoned car. This was a message, a breadcrumb left by something, or someone, who knew he'd find it. The realization coiled in his gut, cold and heavy. He wasn't alone out here, Dot. And for the first time, he wondered if he ever had been. Now, as the wind howls through the skeletal remains of that vehicle, ask yourself, what would you do next? Would you run? Would you search for answers, even if they unraveled everything you thought you knew? Or would you get back in the truck, grip the wheel until your knuckles bled, and drive, knowing, deep down, that the road ahead isn't just unknown, it's waiting? Dot. The highway stretched ahead like a ribbon, unraveling into the unknown, the asphalt glistening under the sickly glow of a half-moon. But the road no longer felt familiar, not after what he had seen. The abandoned rig, its rusted chassis slumped in the ditch like a dying beast, had burrowed into his mind, a specter that refused to fade. Every mile now carried the weight of that discovery. Every shadow whispered secrets he wasn't meant to hear. Dot. His hands gripped the wheel too tightly, knuckles bleached white beneath the dim glow of the dashboard. The hum of the engine, once a steady companion, now felt like a low, ominous growl. He tried to focus on the road, but his eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights where there should be none. The night pressed in around him, thick and suffocating, the kind of darkness that didn't just hide things, it breathes. And out here, in the vast, empty stretch between borders, it felt like the darkness was watching him back. Dot. Then came the sounds. Dot. At first, it was just the wind, howling across the flatlands, rattling the loose panels of his trailer. But then, something else. A faint, rhythmic clink, like metal tapping against metal, too deliberate to be the wind, too close to be ignored. His pulse quickened as he scanned the mirrors again. Nothing. Just the endless blackness and the occasional flicker of his own headlights, bouncing off road signs. But the sound persisted, a ghostly echo that seemed to shift positions, now behind him, now to the side, now inside the cab. Dot. He killed the radio. The silence that followed was worse. It was the kind of silence that made his skin prickle, the kind that made him question whether he was truly alone. His breath came shorter now, fogging the cold glass of the window. The landscape outside had turned jagged, rock formations jutting from the earth, like broken teeth, their shadows twisting in ways that defied the moon's weak light. He knew these roads. He'd driven them 100 times. But tonight, they felt alien, as if the very land had shifted beneath him, while he wasn't looking. Dot. And then movement, a flicker in the side mirror. Just for a second, gone before he could turn his head. But it was enough. His foot pressed harder on the gas, the engine roaring in protest. The truck lurched forward, eating up the miles with desperate hunger. Yet no matter how fast he went, the feeling of being followed clung to him, a cold hand on the back of his neck. The air in the cab grew thick, charged with something electric, something wrong. Dot. He told himself it was exhaustion, told himself the long hours had warped his senses. But deep down he knew, some things, once seen, cannot be unseen. Some roads, once taken, lead to places that aren't on any map. And as the night deepened around him, one question burned brighter than the rest. What else was out here, waiting in the dark? And why did it feel like it had been waiting for him? The night had swallowed the highway whole, leaving only the faint glow of the dashboard to carve a fragile path through the darkness. He had been driving for what felt like an eternity, the hum of the engine, a monotonous lullaby that did nothing to quiet the storm in his mind. The abandoned vehicle from earlier, its rusted skeleton, picked clean by time and scavengers, still clung to his thoughts like a burr. Its presence had been wrong, unnatural, as if the desert itself had spat it out as a warning. And now, the static of the radio hissed in his ears, a white noise that felt almost deliberate, like something was listening back. Dot. Then Kama, the voice cut through. Dot. It wasn't a dispatch call. It wasn't even human, not entirely. The transmission crackled to life with a wet, distorted breath, the kind that slithered up from the back of a throat, not meant to speak. You shouldn't have stopped. The words were slow, deliberate, each syllable dripping with something thick and cloying, like oil pooling in the bottom of a rusted can. His fingers twitched on the wheel. The mic button was still depressed under his thumb. He hadn't keyed up. No one should be on this channel. Quote. Turn around. The voice again, closer now, as if the speaker had leaned in until their lips brushed the microphone. A static-laced chuckle followed, the kind that didn't belong to laughter, but to something older, something that had watched from the shadows, long before headlights ever cut through the dark. His breath hitched. The cab suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker, like the walls were pressing in. He snatched his hand back from the radio, as if burned. But the voice didn't stop. They're waiting for you at the border, but you won't make it that far. Quote. A cold sweat prickled at his hairline. His instincts screamed at him, floor it, get out, don't look back. But his foot hesitated on the pedal, because the voice hadn't just spoken to him, it had known. Known about the border, known about the route he wasn't supposed to be on, and worse, it had sounded almost pleased by his fear. The radio popped again, this time with a sound that wasn't a voice at all. It was a laugh, high and brittle, like children's voices, layered over one another, whispering in a language that wasn't quite words. His stomach lurched. He had a daughter once. He remembered the way her laughter used to fill the house, bright and unburdened. This wasn't that. This was the sound of something mimicking joy, the way a predator mimics prey, close enough to lure you in, but wrong in ways you couldn't hear. His hands shook as he reached for the radio knob. He had to turn it off. He had to. You're already ours. The words exploded from the speakers, so loud the distortion blew the sound into a screech. He jerked the wheel. The rig swerved, tires spitting gravel as the shoulder of the road gave way to nothingness. For one heart-stopping second, the world tilted, then the truck righted itself with a groan of metal. He didn't remember steering back. His pulse roared in his ears, drowning out the radio's sudden, eerie silence. But the damage was done, because now he knew. Whatever had taken those other drivers, the ones in the stories they whispered about at truck stops, the ones who vanished mid-route, their rigs found empty months later, it wasn't just chance. It wasn't bad luck. It was hunting. And it had just found him. The road ahead stretched endlessly, but for the first time, he realized something terrible. He didn't recognize it anymore. The landmarks were wrong. The stars above didn't align with the maps in his glove box. And when he glanced at the fuel gauge, the needle twitched once, then dropped like a stone. He was out of time, out of options, and the border, wherever it was, felt like a cruel joke now. Because the voice hadn't been a warning. It had been a promise. The night had swallowed the road whole, and with it, any semblance of familiarity. The dashboard clock ticked forward like a slow, mocking heartbeat, each second stretching into an eternity as the numbers flipped with cruel indifference. 2 hours had bled into 3, then 4, and still, the highway refused to surrender its secrets. He had driven this route 100 times before, a straight shot through quiet farmland, a loop so simple it barely required thought. But now, the asphalt beneath him twisted like a living thing, coiling deeper into a labyrinth of shadows, where the headlights carved only fleeting paths, before the dark swallowed them again. His fingers tightened around the wheel, knuckles pale as moonlight through skeletal trees. The radio had long since surrendered to static, that earlier transmission, those hollow whispering words, now just another ghost in the cab. He tried to shake the memory of it, the way the voice had slithered into his ears, like smoke curling around his thoughts, until doubt took root. Turn back, that's what it had said, or had it? The words had dissolved before he could grasp them, leaving only the echo of something unnatural, something that didn't belong in the hum of a trucker's lonely night. The fuel gauge was a betrayal in itself, the needle dipping lower with each passing mile, a silent countdown to stranding. He should have reached the depot by now, should have unloaded, signed the paperwork, called home to tell his wife the run was smooth just like always. But the road had other plans. It stretched endlessly, a black ribbon unspooling into nothingness. The occasional road sign warped by time or deliberate malice, their letters rearranged into nonsense. His stomach twisted. Was that a yield sign? Or had the rust eaten it into something else entirely? Something that watched, something that waited. Desperation clawed at his throat. He rolled down the window, letting the cold night air slash at his face, as if the bite of it could shock him back to reality. The scent of damp earth and something older, something metallic, filled the cab. He leaned out, squinting into the void, searching for a landmark, a light, anything. But there was only the dark pressing in like a weight, and the distant hum of the engine, a dying pulse in the vast, indifferent night. He thought of his family then. His daughter's laughter, the way she'd wave from the porch when he pulled into the driveway. His wife's voice, steady and warm, the anchor that kept him from drifting. The memory was a knife twist. If he didn't make it back, would they ever know what happened? Would they search for him, or would the road simply erase him, like it had erased every other trace of the known world? A sign loomed ahead, its surface pocked with age. He slowed, heart hammering against his ribs, as the headlights illuminated the faded letters. Welcome to. The rest was gone, devoured by time, or something hungrier. His breath hitched. That wasn't right. That wasn't anywhere he recognized. The truck groaned as he braked, the sudden stillness amplifying the silence around him. For a moment there was nothing. No wind, no insects, no distant rumble of traffic, just the suffocating quiet of a place that had forgotten how to be found. And then, movement. A flicker at the edge of the headlight's reach. His pulse roared in his ears as he strained to see, hands slick on the wheel. Was it an animal? A trick of the exhaust fumes? Or was it something standing just beyond the light, watching him back? The air in the cab turned thick, each breath a struggle. He knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in his veins, that he wasn't just lost. He was being led. The night had swallowed the road whole, leaving only the faint glow of the dashboard to carve a fragile path through the darkness. He had been driving for what felt like an eternity, yet the landmarks refused to align. The miles stretched like taffy, and the GPS had long since surrendered to a spinning blue dot of defeat. His hands, slick with sweat, gripped the wheel as if it were the last tether to sanity. The hum of the engine, once a steady companion, now pulsed like a slow, ominous heartbeat. And then, there, a figure, standing motionless in the middle of the road. Not a hitchhiker, not a lost traveler, something else entirely. The headlights sliced through the gloom, casting a long, warped shadow that seemed to ripple unnaturally against the asphalt. The silhouette was wrong. Too tall, too still. The proportions skewed, as if the air itself had bent to accommodate its presence. His breath hitched, fingers tightening around the wheel, until his knuckles screamed. The rig slowed to a crawl, the brakes whispering in protest. He should have honked. He should have swerved. But something deep in his gut, something primal and ancient, locked his muscles in place. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch, just waited. A cold dread slithered up his spine. The cab suddenly felt too small, the air too thick, as if the walls were pressing inward. His pulse roared in his ears, drowning out the idle growl of the engine. Who or what stands in the middle of nowhere at 3 a.m? The question clawed at his mind, but the answer refused to surface. Then the figure lifted an arm, not in greeting, not in warning, but in a slow, deliberate gesture, as if beckoning him forward. His foot trembled over the gas pedal. Every instinct screamed to turn back, to flee into the darkness he knew, even if it was a labyrinth of the unknown. But the figure's stillness was hypnotic, its presence a gravitational pull he couldn't resist. The rig inched closer, 10 feet, 5. The headlights spilled over the figure's form, and for a single horrifying moment, he thought he saw A face, not a stranger's. Not quite. The realization struck like a blade between his ribs. His breath came in ragged gasps, his vision blurring at the edges. That's impossible. The words echoed in his skull, but the figure was still there, still watching, still waiting. And then, as the first drops of rain began to patter against the windshield, like skeletal fingers, the figure took a step forward. The world tilted. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howled, a sound so lonely it might as well have been his own soul crying out. He wanted to run, he wanted to wake up, but the figure was close now, close enough to touch the hood of the truck, close enough to— the radio crackled to life, a voice cutting through the static like a knife. "You shouldn't have come back." Quote, and then the lights went out. The figure stood there, too close now to be a trick of the exhaust-fogged air, yet too distant to be anything but a specter carved from the edge of memory. He knew that silhouette, or thought he did. The slump of the shoulders, the way the hands hung loose at the sides, as if weighted by something unseen. It was a stance he'd mirrored 1,000 times in truck stop diners, leaning against the counter, while waiting for coffee black enough to burn away the miles. But the face was wrong. Not in the way of age or time, but in the way of a photograph left too long in the sun. The features bleached into something familiar, yet unrecognizable, like a reflection warped by a cracked mirror. His breath came shallow, the cab's stale air thickening in his lungs, as the figure took another step forward. The gravel crunched, too loud, too deliberate, like the sound of a door sealing shut behind him. How did he know that sound? The question coiled in his chest, tight and suffocating, because he did know it, just as he knew the scent of diesel and damp earth that clung to the air now, though it shouldn't. Not here, not now. His route had been a straight shot, 40 minutes tops, I-10 to the distribution center. Unload, turn around, no detours, no border crossings, no this. Yet here he was, standing on the shoulder of a road he didn't recognize, his boots sinking slightly into soil that felt too soft, too foreign beneath him. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the effort of trying to reconcile the man before him with the ghost of a memory that refused to solidify. The figure's lips moved, but the words didn't reach him at first. Instead, he heard the echo of his own voice from 3 years ago, laughing into a CB radio, telling his wife he'd be home in time for her meatloaf. The taste of it was still on his tongue, the weight of her kiss still warm on his cheek. Then the figure spoke again, and this time, the words cut through the haze like a blade. "You don't remember, do you?" The voice was rough, gravelly, but beneath it lay something worse, pity, as if this stranger, this version of someone he once knew, had been waiting for this moment, waiting for him. The driver's fingers dug into his palms, nails biting crescents into his skin, because the truth was, he didn't remember. Not the last 3 years, not how he'd gotten here, not why his rig, still bearing the company logo like a scar, had been found hundreds of miles from where it should have been, as if it had driven itself across the border while he slept. And that was the worst part, the not knowing. The way his mind skittered away from the edges of the abyss, refusing to look down, even as the figure's shadow stretched longer, darker, swallowing the space between them. He wanted to run. He wanted to scream, but all he could do was stand there, trapped in the suffocating grip of a past that no longer felt like his own. What do you think he saw in that moment? The face of a friend, or the ghost of a man who'd already been lost long before his truck was ever found? The air inside the dimly lit diner thickened with every passing second, as if the very walls were holding their breath. He sat across from the figure, a man whose face flickered between familiarity and something far more unsettling, like a reflection warped by time. The driver's fingers tightened around the chipped coffee cup, the lukewarm liquid untouched, his knuckles white with tension. Then the figure leaned in, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that seemed to slither across the table, wrapping around the driver's senses like a coil of barbed wire. "You remember the storm, don't you? The words weren't a question, they were a blade, twisting. Not the one in the forecast, the other one. The one that hit just as you crossed the county line. A pause, a breath. The one that wasn't there at all. Quote. The driver's pulse hammered against his ribs. He did remember, or at least, he thought he did. The way the headlights had cut through a wall of rain, so dense it felt like driving through liquid night. The way the radio had crackled, then died, leaving only static, a sound that had burrowed into his skull and never quite left. But the storm hadn't been in the reports. His route had been clear, a straight shot. 45 minutes, tops. Quote. They found your rig 3 years later. The figure continued, his voice dropping even lower, forcing the driver to lean in, to strain against the weight of what was coming. But not where it should have been, not even close. It was just outside Juarez, half buried in the sand like it had been there for decades. The license plates, gone. The logbook, wiped clean, except for one entry. Another pause. The figure's eyes, dark, unreadable, locked onto his. Not yours. Quote. The driver's breath hitched. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A sound that suddenly felt like a swarm of insects. Crawling, crawling. Whose name? His voice cracked. He didn't recognize it. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, he slid a faded photograph across the table. A truck. His truck. But the cab was wrong. The paint was peeling in patches, revealing rust underneath. And the company logo had been scratched out, replaced with something else. Something hand-painted. Something that looked like symbols. The driver's stomach twisted. He'd seen those symbols before, in his dreams, scratched into the metal of his own rig the night he vanished. Quote. The other driver, the figure finally said, his voice a razor's edge. The one who took your route that night. The one who should have vanished instead of you. He tapped the photograph. He didn't just disappear, though. He came back 3 weeks later. But he wasn't himself anymore. The figure's gaze darkened. He kept talking about a shift. A wrong turn that wasn't a turn at all. A road that wasn't on any map. His fingers tightened around the edge of the photo, crumpling it slightly. They found him a year after that, hanging from a bridge outside El Paso. No note, just a single word carved into the beam above him. The driver's blood turned to ice. Remember. The diner's door creaked open, letting in a gust of wind that howled like a warning. The figure didn't flinch. His voice dropped to a whisper so cold it burned. You weren't supposed to be the one who came back. Quote. The driver's hands shook. The coffee cup clattered to the floor, shattering. The pieces scattered like the fragments of his memory, sharp, jagged, impossible to piece together. But one thought cut through the chaos, clear and terrifying. What if he wasn't the driver at all? What if for 3 years he'd been something else entirely, something that had worn his face, his life, like a stolen skin? The figure stood, his chair scraping against the linoleum. You feel it, don't you? He murmured. The pull, the road calling you back. He reached into his coat, pulling out a folded map. Not a modern one. This was paper, yellowed with age, the ink bleeding at the edges. A route was circled in red. A route that didn't exist on any GPS. A route that started where the driver had vanished and ended where his truck had been found. You have to go back, the figure said, pressing the map into his trembling hands. Before it realizes, you're not him anymore. Quote. The diner's lights flickered. For a heartbeat, the figure's face wasn't a face at all. It was a void, a silence. Then the lights steadied, and he was just a man again, except his eyes. His eyes were still wrong. The driver unfolded the map. His fingers traced the red line, and something deep inside him recognized it, not with fear, not with dread, with hunger. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. The weight of the revelation pressed down on him, like the thick, suffocating air of a storm about to break. His hands, once steady on the wheel, guiding tons of steel with practiced ease, now trembled as the memories surged back in fragments. sharp and unforgiving. The hum of the engine, the scent of diesel, the way the road stretched endlessly ahead under the glow of the dashboard lights. It all came rushing in, but twisted, distorted, as if viewed through cracked glass. He had driven this route 100 times before, a short haul, less than an hour. Yet here he stood, 3 years later, staring at the rusted hulk of his own rig, abandoned in a place he didn't recognize. A place that shouldn't have been possible. The first memory struck like a blade. The last call to dispatch. His voice calm, routine. Copy that. Heading out now. ETA in 45. Then, nothing. No skid marks. No signs of struggle. No final transmission. Just silence. But now, as the truth unraveled before him, the silence wasn't empty. It was alive. Whispering. The road hadn't just swallowed him whole. It had taken him somewhere else, somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. His breath hitched as the faces of his family flickered behind his eyes. His wife's smile as she handed him his thermos. His daughter's laughter as she waved from the porch. Had they spent 3 years believing he'd simply vanished? Or worse, had they been told a lie? Betrayal coiled in his gut, cold and venomous. Someone had known. Someone had let this happen. The figures in the shadows of his memories shifted. Other drivers, dispatch voices, the vague outlines of men in uniforms who never quite looked him in the eye. Had they all been part of it? The questions clawed at him, relentless. Why this route? Why him? And how had his truck ended up hundreds of miles away, across a border he never intended to cross? The answers were there, just beyond reach, taunting him from the edges of his fractured recollections. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of the rig, a mournful sound that seemed to carry voices from the past. He could almost hear the hum of the engine again, the way it had sputtered that night. Not from mechanical failure, but from something else, something unseen. His fingers brushed the rusted door handle, and for a moment he was back in the cab, the dashboard lights flickering erratically as the world outside the windshield warped. The road ahead, bending in ways that defied logic. Had he been drugged? Hypnotized? Or was there something far darker at play? Something that didn't just erase a man from his life, but replaced him with a ghost of himself. The realization settled over him like a shroud. He wasn't just searching for answers, he was searching for himself. The man who had left that night was gone. The one standing here now was a stranger in his own skin, piecing together a puzzle where every clue only deepened the mystery. And as the first drops of rain began to fall, mingling with the rust and the dust, he knew the road ahead wasn't just a path to the truth. It was a descent into something far more dangerous, something that had been waiting for him all along. What would you do if the life you remembered was a lie? If the people you trusted had betrayed you? And if the only way to find out why was to step back into the darkness that had swallowed you whole? The night is long, the road is uncertain, and the answers, if they exist at all, are buried where no one dares to look. The road stretched ahead, like a ribbon unspooling into the unknown, each mile pulling him deeper into a labyrinth of questions that refused to unravel. He gripped the wheel harder, knuckles whitening under the strain, as if sheer force could anchor him to something, anything, solid in the storm of uncertainty. The hum of the engine was the only steady rhythm in a world suddenly tilted on its axis, a mechanical heartbeat, counting down to an answer he wasn't sure he wanted to find, but he had to know. That was the one truth, burning brighter than the fear coiling in his gut. His mind was a storm of fragmented thoughts, each one sharper than the last. How had his rig ended up here? Hundreds of miles from the route he'd driven 1,000 times before. The logistics defied reason. Border crossings, paperwork, the sheer impossibility of it all. Yet there it was, a ghostly echo of his own life, abandoned like a relic in a place that smelled of secrets. He could almost taste the metallic tang of dread on his tongue, the same flavor that had flooded his mouth 3 years ago when he first realized something was wrong. But back then, he'd been powerless, a man erased from his own story. Now he had the wheel in his hands, And that changed everything. Ugh. Every shadow seemed to whisper. Every gust of wind carried the weight of a warning. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to retreat to the safety of the known. But retreat meant living in the dark forever, and he'd spent enough years there already. So he pressed on, the needle on the speedometer creeping higher, as if outrunning the fear could bring him closer to the truth. He thought of the last time he'd sat in this seat, the familiarity of the cab, the way the radio had crackled with static as he'd hummed along to a song he couldn't name. That man, the one who'd believed in routine, in the predictability of a short haul, felt like a stranger now, because that man hadn't known what it was like to stare into the abyss and have it stare back. This version of himself, he understood the cost of ignorance, and he was done paying it. A sign flickered past in the periphery, its letters blurred by speed and the sheen of his own determination. He didn't need to read it to know he was getting closer. The air itself felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. His breath came shorter, his pulse a drumbeat in his ears, but his resolve was iron. He would find his rig. He would touch its cold metal, trace the faded company logo with his fingertips, and demand answers from the silence. And if the truth was uglier than he could bear, well, he'd already survived the not knowing. What was one more scar? The night swallowed the road behind him, but he didn't look back. There was nothing left in the rear view except ghosts. Ahead, though, ahead lay the possibility of something real, even if it destroyed him, especially if it did, because some questions once asked refused to stay buried, and some men, they refused to let them. The road beneath him had turned to gravel hours ago, each crunch of the tires echoing like a slow drumbeat counting down to something he couldn't name. The air smelled different here, dry, laced with the faint metallic tang of rust and something else. Something acrid, like old smoke clinging to the walls of a long-abandoned building. His hands gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles pale beneath the dim glow of the dashboard lights. He hadn't meant to come this far. But the map had led him here, to this stretch of nowhere, where the GPS signal flickered in and out like a dying pulse. And then he saw it. At first, it was just a shape in the dark, a hulking silhouette half swallowed by the overgrown brush, its edges softened by years of wind and rain. But as his headlights swept over it, the details snapped into focus with brutal clarity. The faded logo on the cab door, peeling but still legible. The rusted chrome bumper, dented in a way that made his stomach clench. The way the driver's side window was rolled down, just enough to suggest a hasty exit, or something far worse. His breath hitched. It was his rig, not just any truck. His truck, the one he'd climbed into 3 years ago for a routine delivery that should have taken 40 minutes, tops. The one that had vanished without a trace. He killed the engine, but the silence that followed wasn't empty. It hummed, thick with the weight of questions he'd buried deep, the kind that gnawed at you in the dead of night when the world was too quiet. His boots crunched on the gravel as he stepped out, the sound unnaturally loud, like he was trespassing on his own life. The door of the abandoned rig groaned when he pulled it open, the hinges protesting after years of disuse. Inside, the scent hit him first, stale, sour, like old sweat, and something chemical, something that didn't belong. The seat was still adjusted to his height. The coffee stain on the console, the one he'd cursed at for weeks before the disappearance, was still there, faded but unmistakable. His gloves lay on the dash, stiff with dust, as if he'd just stepped away for a moment. His fingers trembled as he reached for the logbook tucked behind the seat. The pages were warped, the ink bleeding into Rorschach, blots of dates and locations that made no sense. The last entry wasn't his handwriting. It was sloppy, frantic, the letters slanting like the writer had been in a hurry or afraid. The date was wrong, too. 3 days after he'd vanished. His pulse roared in his ears as he traced the words with his fingertip. The paper brittle beneath his touch. Crossed at Laredo. No stop. No check. And then, scrawled in the margin, almost as an afterthought, "They're watching. Quote, a cold sweat prickled at the base of his neck. He knew this place. Not the physical location, the desolation, the way the horizon swallowed the road whole, but the feeling of it. The oppressive weight of being seen without knowing by whom. The certainty that he'd been here before, standing in this exact spot, his mind foggy, his body moving on autopilot, while something else, something darker, pulled the strings. The realization coiled around his ribs, squeezing until he could barely draw breath. This wasn't just about a missing truck. This was about the gaps in his memory. The nights he'd woken up gasping, his sheets damp with sweat, the taste of diesel and copper on his tongue. This was about the way his hands had moved on their own. That last night, turning the wheel toward the border, while his mind screamed at him to stop. He stumbled back, his boot catching on a rusted toolbox half buried in the dirt. It clanged open, spilling its contents. A wrench, a flashlight, and a single crumpled photograph. He didn't need to pick it up to know what it was. The edges of the image were singed, as if someone had tried to burn it, but changed their mind. His wife's smile stared up at him, her eyes crinkled at the corners, the way they did when she was trying not to laugh. On the back, in his own handwriting, the words, "If you're reading this, don't trust the radio." The wind howled across the empty stretch of land, carrying with it the whisper of tires on asphalt, the distant rumble of an engine. His blood turned to ice. He wasn't alone. He'd never been alone. And now, standing in the shadow of his own abandoned rig, he understood the terrible truth. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The question wasn't how the truck got here. The question was why he had been allowed to find it, and what they wanted him to do next.